In this lecture, I wish to examine the role that iconoclastic interactions play in how people live and interact with public monuments. What can the everyday interactions with public statues and monuments show us about the nature of the monument and people's relationship to it? And how can we trace and analyze these monument-citizen interactions? Before I examine these questions, I will provide you with some background for my project and then say a few words on why I think that the interactions that I examine should be considered iconoclasm. I will also briefly want to say that I'll be using the terms public statues and monument a bit loosely and interchangeable. I had some really great discussions on the specificities of monument yesterday at Andrew's exhibition. However, my project studies an archive residing in the municipality of Copenhagen, where the use of words such as statue, sculpture, monument, and memorial is used a bit more loosely, and this discourse might have rubbed off on the presentation. So with that disclaimer, I will give you a brief background for my project. The primary aim of the project is to create knowledge about the role and function of iconoclastic practices through a study of 60 years of unauthorized interactions with public statues and monuments in Copenhagen. Iconoclasm has always been a part of wars, conflict, and protest movement, but in recent years, global protests against statues and monuments have increased the interest in the phenomenon. In general, art historical research into iconoclasm has primarily focused on spectacular events such as these, with also the destruction during the Reformation, the French Revolution, and the fall of the Soviet Union as obvious examples. During my PhD, I worked with both the Islamic State's iconoclastic destruction of cultural heritage and the toppling of statues in the US and the UK. Most recently, I have investigated climate activists' attacks on works of art in museum and public spaces. This focus in both my own and in iconoclasm research in general has, however, left everyday iconoclasm, the less spectacular interaction with and transformation of monuments, statues, and sculptures, as an under-prioritized area of research within iconoclasm studies. While iconoclasm is often associated with spectacular events, iconoclastic practices also include smaller and less spectacular actions, which are often either overlooked or considered vandalism. Working from the premise that iconoclastic interactions are meaningful expressions, even when they do not appear as such, the project examines these interactions as a crucial part of how we negotiate public space, as well as our shared history, memory, and identity. This could be, and as in this case, the very harmless interaction with the statue Firbenstræberen in Ørstedsparken, which is often decorated with flowers and branches from the park. I took these pictures myself on my way to work last year. However, the project is not only based on my phone's camera roll, but on an extensive photographic archive consisting of more than 2,000 photographs and 800 negatives. The archive belonged to the municipality of Copenhagen, and it documents various interactions with the city's public statues and monuments over the last 60 years. It was created by Jens Peter Munk, who became known as Monumentmanden, in English, the Monument Man, while he was responsible for the maintenance of the monuments in public space in Copenhagen, a role that he held for more than 20 years. So the archive is a combination of photos that Munk has taken himself and photos that he has found through his work. These two images are from the archive, documenting Dragspringvandet, the dragon fountain at the City Hall, that were filled with soap in 1999, and Jens Lund's sculptures Fall Spring with painted eyes and breast in 1990. As art historical research on iconoclasm has mainly focused on spectacular events, the type of everyday iconoclastic interventions that are documented in the archive is an extremely underexplored research subject. Interaction with public statues are often only documented if they are either reported to the police or make the news, which a lot of the interactions depicted in this archive has not been. Even in museums, where the threshold for what counts as unauthorized interaction is somewhat lower than in public spaces, these kinds of events are rarely systematically documented. As several researchers in the field of art vandalism has pointed out, the documentation of unauthorized interaction with works of art is both sparse and disorganized. Instead, research often relies on anecdotes and individual memories, which often leaves the most spectacular events at the center. The archive therefore represents a unique opportunity to investigate and unfold how people relate to and interact with public monuments. So, my research project studies the interactions depicted in the archive and maps their targets and modes of intervention, as well as the reception of these actions and the context they happen within. Particular attention will be given to monuments and statues that are more frequently interacted with, in order to investigate if repeated modes of intervention can be observed. So through a combination of archival studies, interviews, and visual analysis, I'll also study the interactions' context and receptions. When did the interaction take place? Are the interactions connected to general discussions or to specific events? And how do the authorities react to the interactions? So before I move on to the contents of the archive, I will say a few words on why I think that these types of interactions should be considered iconoclasm, and why I think that it's important to take them seriously and not brush them off as pointless vandalism. What is and isn't iconoclasm is a recurrent debate in the study of iconoclasm. As most researchers dealing with iconoclasm has found, the terminology of the field can be really difficult to use, and it often seems to cover either too much or too little. The term iconoclasm describes the destruction of images in a broad sense. The term iconoclasm comes from the Greek word of icon and clastis, and the origin of its use in English comes from the Latin word iconoclastis, which translates to image breaker. However, there is no clear definition of which actions fall into the category of iconoclasm, with it being difficult to define what the icon in iconoclasm is and what it takes to break it. Is an event iconoclastic if the damage inflicted was not intentional? Is it iconoclasm if the target of the action does not sustain any physical damage? How do you break an icon, and at what point is it considered broken? The definition of the term iconoclasm grew from the destruction of religious images and opposition to religious uses of images, to the destruction of and opposition to all different kinds of images, including objects that are not easily categorized as such, for example, sites and landscapes. The term is mostly used to describe deliberate destructive actions toward images, but it can also refer to a symbolic act in which an object is transformed into something with new symbolic meaning. In the case of the destruction of Bouchardon's statue of Louis XV during the French Revolution, which you can see an image of to your left, the statue had been subjected to, amongst other things, satirical songs and drawings that turned the statue into a symbol of Louis XV's grandson and successor, Louis XVI, and the hated institution that he represented. This gradual transformation led to the toppling of the statue in 1792. Sorry, numbers. Many of the typologies of iconoclastic interactions builds on studies of the Reformation and the French Revolution, leaving both contemporary expressions of iconoclasm and the less spectacular engagement with images rather unexplored. Furthermore, some of the canonical literature on the motives of iconoclasm are based on the studies of individual attackers who are often suffering from mental illnesses. In his influential article, Iconoclasts and Their Motives, art historian David Friedberg argued that the examination of individual iconoclastic acts, quote, preferably where it is isolated from any kind of socially accepted behavior, made it possible to study the relationship between people and images. However, it also continued the perception of iconoclasts and their actions as either irrational, ignorant, or brutal. While the research into the past year's events has nuanced this image, iconoclasm is still often viewed as something happening on the fringes of society, conducted by unstable individuals, angry mobs, or convinced ideologues. In contrast, I believe that these kinds of interventions should be viewed as meaningful iconoclastic acts. Following researchers such as Dario Gamboni and Richard Clay, I view iconoclasm as a process of sign transformation and emphasize the role of iconoclastic acts as a struggle over symbolic meaning rather than the symbol breaking of an object. It is my hypothesis that these iconoclastic interactions are far more normal and widespread than previously described in research, and that the study of the more frequent everyday interactions could contribute to a broader understanding of how people live with art and images. So this brings us back again to the municipality's archive. I'm still in the early stages of my research, but tonight I wanted to share some of my preliminary thoughts and findings with you. At the moment, I'm in the process of familiarizing myself more with the archive. The initial idea was to get a broad and overarching view of the interactions and then conduct close readings of specific incidents, modes of destruction, monuments, and periods of time. While the archive is generally a treasure trove, it's also really messy and unorganized. It has only been partly digitized, which makes it more difficult to get the overview of the archive and the interactions it depicts than what I had hoped for. This also makes some of the questions that I want to examine more difficult to answer, like when the interaction took place, if the interactions are connected to specific events, and how the authorities have reacted to the interactions. At the moment, I'm arranging interviews with current and former employees at the municipality to learn more about the different episodes that are depicted in the archive. I've so far only had the opportunity to do one informal interview with Jens Peter Munk, so what I'm presenting for you today is still very much a work in progress. I'm currently categorizing the photographs in the archive, focusing on the types of monuments, the mode of intervention, and I'm really interested in seeing how and if the modes of intervention correlate to the types of statues and the monuments targeted. So, the city of Copenhagen owns and administrates and maintains around 370 public monuments, which include a wide range of public artworks, memorials, statues, sculptures, and fountains. Most of the targeted monuments in the archive depicts humans or human-like figures, like the Little Mermaid. And there are only a few targets which does not in one way or another depict humans. So the targeted monuments often consist of a statue and then a pedestal or a base, and it's quite clear that the statues are often targeted with signs and symbols, while the pedestal becomes carriers of written messages. So targeting larger monuments, the pedestal is also often the most accessible, as you would either have to bring a ladder or climb the monument in order to be able to target the human figure on this monument. We can see it here, where the monument Modstandsbevægelsens Faldne has had its pedestal targeted with the word fri hash and pig, roughly translated to legalize marijuana and dick. However, it's not only a question of accessibility. The monument to King Frederick IX consists of a statue of the king and blocks of granite behind the statue, and here it is the blocks that are targeted in the intervention, even though the statue of the king is just as easily accessible as the granite blocks. Here we can see that it might have been the smoother surface of a monument that are used for writing messages. These flat and smooth areas are obviously easier to write on than the statues themselves, whose surfaces does not provide quite the same canvas for written messages. We can observe this preference in many of the photographed interventions, though we also have examples whose back has been used as carriers of written messages. Like here, where the statue of the Nile has the statement, "Talk to strangers," written on its back, while the statue Fall, or Spring, has the words "fanget," or trapped, written on its back. As we can see from this example, when examining the targets and modes of intervention, the categories often overlap, as the choice of targeting, for example, the pedestal of a monument, could both be considered a choice of target and a mode of intervention. The methods present in the archive roughly falls into two categories: adding and subtracting interventions. The adding interventions consist primarily of painting and spray painting, as well as adding foreign elements and objects to the monuments, like sunglasses on statues and soap in fountains. So the adding intervention can be written statement, like to your left, where Free Palestine has been written on the base of the Genforenings monument. Drawings and symbols, like the 3 yellow dots, symbolizing support for the free town Christiania, painted on the chests of the Danish sculptor Bertel Thorvaldsen. And then also paint splattered on statues, like here on the Little Mermaid. We also have examples of what I've tried to call graffiti dressing, where the statues either get their clothes painted or get clothes painted on their naked bodies. I'll say a little bit more about this practice in a minute. But first, the subtracting interventions are interventions in which something is either damaged, destroyed, or removed from the monuments, like here, where the depicted statues have had their arms and heads removed, or here, where monuments have been toppled and damaged in the fall. In many of the instances, we do not have a perpetrator nor a clear motives. This is the challenges of examining interventions that has not been investigated by the police. However, as sociologist Bisset points out in her examination of vandalism in art museums, quote, methodology can be said to be heavily influenced by the amount of planning the vandal engaged in, i.e., whether or not the act was premeditated. The instrument used to perform the attack thus reveals important information, since it informs us about the intentional nature of the act of vandalism. Unsurprisingly, spontaneous attacks are committed with the limited arsenal at hand, usually physically with fists, feet, chewing gums, or car keys. The introduction of unusual items like knives, hammers, and vomiting dye in the vandal attack is a clear marker that the act was premeditated, end quote. So while her point pertains to interventions perpetrated in museums, I think it's also useful when examining these types of interventions. For example, the introduction of a dead shark in the Gefion fountain was clearly a premeditated action. This intervention has been filed in the archive as a happening, but the motive for it and the reasoning behind it is for now lost. But in the photo you see the municipalities, people removing the shark from the fountain. Yeah. So we might also talk about different degrees of premeditation, as many types of graffiti could clearly be considered premeditated, as carrying spray paint suggests that you will use it. However, it is unclear whether the choice of target was premeditated or if it was just that the perpetrator happened to pass by. In line with Bisset's observation, it seems obvious that there are more premeditated intention in the interventions in which the target is, for example, splattered in paint, than when they are just tagged, like you see here. Tags occur on a variety of surfaces, from buildings to trash cans, and it often doesn't seem like the specific surface matter all that much. The choice of both targets and methods of intervention as an expression of intentionality can be observed in a series of interventions in Ørstedsparken in 1984, where activists painted erotic symbols on monuments and wrote queer political graffiti across their base. Ørstedsparken is a popular gay cruising park in central Copenhagen, which has both functioned as a site for homophobic violence as well as queer resistance for decades. The activists here primarily used white paint, but also red, green, and pink spray paint. The paint was used to color the genitals of the statues, giving them garters, painting their faces, and in one instance, marking the statue with painted handprints. So the written graffiti were slogans, which in 1989 were frequently used by the gay activist group Bøssernes Befrielsesfront, liberally translated to the Gay Liberation Front. Recognizing the slogan from his work on queer culture, my colleague in Moving Monuments and professor in art history, Mathias Danbolt, has traced these interventions to the group and has been able to track down the minutes from the group's meeting in which they planned the action. And here it becomes very obvious that both the choice of method and targets were very well thought out. Yeah, sorry for the Danish accent. So another aspect that I'm particularly interested is the use of clothing, both actual clothing and painted clothing, as well as we saw in the interventions in Ørstedsparken. I've so far been able to observe, I think, 3 different types of dressing of public monuments. First, there are examples of using statues as carriers of lost items like scarves and sunglasses. I don't think it's really clear on this image, but one of the sons has some really fast sunglasses on to the left. Then there are more deliberate acts like dressing statues up for winter in winter coats, or like the photo in the middle, giving the statue fodboldspilleren, the football player, the winning team's jersey on. The statue is placed close to Parken, which is where most of the football games are played in Copenhagen. And then there are the graffiti dressing, which is also very deliberate. So dressing and adorning statues can also be part of a protest act, like Just Stop Oil, dressing statues in high-vis orange vests, the so-called yarn bombing of the Colton statue, and the act of guerrilla knitting in Charlottesville in the US. So the yarn bombing of the Colton statue happened in 2018 amidst heated discussions on a new plaque for the statue, which was supposed to acknowledge Colton's role as a slave trader. The shackling of the statue's feet in a red woolen ball and chain highlights this part of the statue's history. And to your right is the Kutsu project in Charlottesville, which emerged in the aftermath of the violent protests surrounding the planned removal of statues of Confederate General in Charlottesville in 2017. It was a project that spanned across the city, and it sought to cover statues in knitted kutsu lines, thus both covering them up while highlighting their obsoleteness. This is from last fall, where the protest group Just Stop Oil dressed a handful of statues, both in museums and public space, in high-vis orange vests, and adding speech bubbles to them. In their press release, Just Stop Oils described the statues of Demeter and highlights her role as the goddess of agriculture and fertility. And I think I would argue that the role of this protest is to, in a sense, bring the god to life so that she can judge our actions or inactions. And continuing this line of thought, what I'm particularly interested in at the moment is how these different types of dressing and adorning statues and monuments are somehow, possibly, connected to a broader history of interaction with statues. So as we now know, the white marble statues that has been one of the mainstays in the story of the origin of Western culture were in fact not white, but polychrome. Greco-Roman statues were colorfully painted, and they were also often adorned with textiles and jewelry, as well as flower wreaths and garlands. Cecilie Brandt, who's a senior researcher at the New Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen, has argued that the sculptures that we see in museums today are more like skeletons, as they were not done once they had been carved out in marble. After centuries of scholarship focusing on the shape and form of Greco-Roman sculpture, Brandt is now part of what she called a sensorial turn, which aims at drawing closer to the people who built and interacted with these works. In her most recent research, she shows that the sculptures were not only dressed, but also scented in order to make them look and smell more lifelike. The goal was to make the sculpture look as lifelike as possible so that you would feel that the gods were alive and present. It might be a bit far-fetched, but I think a version of the practice of coloring and adorning statues with clothing and flowers can be observed in the archive. Here, it's done with different types of paints, which highlight different features of the statues. Some of the statues' dressing seem ritualistic in a not completely unsimilar manner as ancient sculptures. Brandt has argued that the ancient statues were not permanently dressed, but adorned in connection with certain rituals. In this photo, the statue of the Nile, a reproduction of the ancient statue, is dressed in knitted red hats, which is something that occurs every year around Christmas. It is unclear when this tradition started, but when I interviewed Jens Peter Munch, he said that he believed that this has been going on for at least 10 years now, and maybe even more. Asked about how the municipalities react to dressing, Munch told me that it depends on the clothing. For example, the Nile has also been dressed in Palestine scarf, which were quickly removed. Otherwise, Munch said that most items of clothing will be removed within a week if it's not considered offensive. And the knitted hats on the Nile has now been allowed to stay through December because it's become a tradition. So the presentation of flowers and branches in the hands of Vierbeenstreberen also seems like a similar, although very unofficial, ritual that are carried by bypasses. The flowers and branches in the statues is not always present, but it changes, I will say, every 2 weeks. So the act of dressing can also be said to be a part of activating the statues or turning them on. In his book, The Everyday Life of Memorials, architectural historian Andrew M. Schenken have described how memorials are either turned on or turned off, like a light switch. The memorials are turned on special occasions or at heated moments like during protest, and the rest of the time the memorials are turned off. Through the examples that I will show you, I'm currently exploring how the dressing and adornment of a statue could act as a form of turning on of statues and monuments. Schenken described the rituals performed around memorials during special occasions as a part of turning them on, like here, where the birthday of the former director of the Central Bank of Denmark, Laurits Nicolai Hvidt, is celebrated with a laurel wreath wrapped around the neck of the bust. So what I want to explore is how different types of interventions not only turn statues and monuments on, but also draws attention to the statue's human likeness. Like the ancient statues, the dressing of the statues makes them more lifelike. You become more aware of both their presence and their form. Here, you can see the photo to the right is a photo of a statue called Kvinde med spejl, or Woman with Mirror. And I took the photo myself in December. The statue is placed near where my mother-in-law lives, and before it was wearing a red bikini and a Christmas hat. I had never noticed it before. So seeing the little mermaid with a winter coat on and woman with mirror in a knitted bikini makes you aware not only of their presence, but I would argue also of their nudity. In the same way that certain types of monuments can seem invisible through their naturalized presence in the public space, like monuments to monarch or other great men, statues like these are not necessarily thought of as statues of naked women until item of clothing makes their previous nudity apparent. So David Friedberg has described how iconoclastic and sensorial acts take stereotypical forms that are evident across centuries, like, for example, the crossing out of eyes, which seeks to eliminate what is most lively in an image in order to diminish its power. However, I think that we are also able to observe in the archive a way in which iconoclastic interaction can also do the opposite. Here, I think dressing and adornment of statues rather highlights than eliminates the life in them. The graffiti dressing of the statues in Ørstedsparken was not an act of erasure, on the contrary. As the statues were adorned with garnets and their genitals were painted in bright colors, the interventions highlighted the life in the statues and imagined them as sexual beings. Combined with slogans like free sex and gays are beautiful, the intervention created a strong political statement. The statue of Apollo Belvedere, which is often described as one of the greatest ancient sculptures and the embodiment of aesthetic perfection, has written Den gode bøsse, the good gay, on its base, recontextualizing the statue's theme of male beauty and perfection. The interactions highlight the park's history as a gay cruising spot and makes you imagine the statues as both witness to and participants in the park's nightly activities. Returning to the question that I posed in the beginning of my lecture, which were, what can the everyday interaction with public statues and monuments show us about the nature of these and people's relationship with them? Based on my initial studies of the archive, which I have presented today, I argued that the interactions with public statues and monuments are an important part of how we engage with public monuments and re-evaluate public spaces as well as identity and history. Following the recent years' debate on public monuments, this quote from the Austrian author Robert Musil's essay on monumental sculpture has gained widespread popularity. Quote, "There is nothing in this world as invisible as the monument. They are no doubt erected to be seen, indeed, to attract attention. But at the same time, they are impregnated with something that repels attention, causing the glance to roll right off, like water droplets of an oilcloth, without even pausing for a moment." So while Musil's quote is often used to indicate that traditional monuments have become obsolete, the essay itself is a reflection on the paradoxical invisibility of monuments, in which Musil described their normalized presence in public space and the power that lies in this normalization. The past decades, monument activism has problematized this presence through different types of interventions and challenged the long-held legitimacy of certain monuments, The scholarly debate that has accompanied this has argued that these interventions have changed the monumental landscape from being relatively accepted to being marked by critical confrontation and call for change. While I do not wish to refute this, I do, however, wish to point to the interventions depicted in the archive as interventions which also poke at the normalized present, at apparent invisibility of monuments without necessarily problematize them. Through my initial analysis of the archive, I argue that turning monuments on not only occurs on special occasions or during heated debates. Instead, I think that the act of turning statues and monuments on and off through different types of interactions and interventions is something that happens on a much more everyday level, and that it is a testament to how people engage with their surrounding and exist in a monumental landscape. Thank you so much for your time.